people dying of starvation, it's not an accident. It's because they wanted to starve us to death. If they're willing to clap for him when he says we've killed no civilians, even though you all have seen him kill thousands of Palestinian families, that's just a green light to kill more Palestinians. 76 years of impunity. If you get away with a crime and you get away with it over and over, what ends up happening is that you will commit more crimes. Your crimes will become more vicious, more frequent. In his own words, we want to finish the job. The job is extermination. And then he was received with claps, and that was the green light. Go ahead, finish the job, complete the annihilation. I'm watching videos of Gaza right now, and I'm seeing the rapid spread of skin diseases amongst Palestinian children, 2-3 years old. Horrible skin diseases. Their skin is literally peeling off, and there's no medication. These are all very treatable skin diseases, which could be treated if there was medication, but there is no medication because Israel doesn't allow it into Gaza.
Polio, which is a super 1940s disease. So they really are going back to the Nazi era.
Hello and welcome to episode 126 of the Palestine Pod, the weekly podcast where we break down the latest headlines dealing with Palestine from all over the world and bring you stories, commentary, and interviews with the aim of supporting the Palestinian struggle for decolonization, justice, and equal rights. I'm one of your hosts, Lara E. You might know me from Instagram as @GazanGirl, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mikey B.
What's up, y'all? Mikey B on TikTok, Michael Schertzer on Instagram, and you can call me Mikey Intifada if you think it's normal for the White House to do Netanyahu's laundry. It's just a few suitcases.
Before we get into today's episode, please like, comment, subscribe if you hang out with us on YouTube. If you're listening on a podcast app, subscribe and leave a review. As always, you can find our full episodes and sources on PalestinePod.com. And if you want to get involved in the conversation, reach out to us at PalestinePod@gmail.com and give us a follow on Instagram @ThePalestinePod. You can also find us on Patreon, where you get early access to the Palestine Pod episodes. You also get an additional podcast per week. It's called the Patreon Pod. It's a little more laid back. We talk politics, Palestine, pop culture. We get a little more personal. And we are also hosting our monthly Zoom happy hours with our Patreon subscribers only. So really exciting stuff. Check us out on patreon.com/PalestinePod. There is so much to talk about, and you are muted.
Yeah. Can we? Okay. How does that feel?
I have a confession to make. I could not sit myself through Netanyahu's speech.
Of course not. I didn't watch it. Who's watching that?
Well, in order to analyze it, you have to watch it.
Why would anybody need to analyze it? Literally,
Because
he's been telling the same lies for 70 years.
That's literally what my grandma said. I called her and she said that exact line. She's like, anytime that guy opens his mouth, it's a lie. Everything he says is a lie. He's incapable of telling the truth.
Yes. I think people who watch it have like a self-harm fetish.
Well,
Like,
Rashida Tlaib, for example, sat through it
Yeah, I
with
mean,
her genocide sign, and it's like, okay,
Yeah.
I get it. You had to do that. But like, I don't even know how she did that.
I'm not super impressed by Rashida Tlaib's genocide sign. Okay. She's voted for like funding for the IOF many times. There's an Electronic Intifada article from 2018.
Whoa. With the reference. With the source
course.
article material.
I stay sourced up, baby. Okay.
I knew that was the case for Ilhan Omar, who like is all over the place on this issue. Same with AOC, who will say a good thing and then do 85 bad things. But I didn't know it was also Rashida Tlaib. Regardless, it must have not been easy for her to sit through that. But she did. And it's like, I couldn't even, I opened it up. I started listening and I got about 4 minutes in before like my brain and body just shut down and I just was unable to keep going.
Yeah. No, I think it's very silly to watch anything that he says. And I think that we're at a place where we don't need to analyze what he's saying to break it down because most people already know that he's a liar and that everything he's saying is a lie. Actually, of the opinion that like it does more harm than good to like reference what he's saying and then like refer to him like he's somebody who we should even be paying attention to.
100%.
He's not.
So I turned it off, but then like social media clipped something and then I ended up seeing that like 1 minute clip. And the 1 minute clip that social media clipped was the part where he goes, I asked my, general, how many civilians have we killed? And he responded, barely any. Standing ovation. You know how I keep saying Palestinians are the most gaslit people on earth? That is a perfect illustration of that. You can literally, for 10 months on a daily basis, multiple times a day, watch videos and images of Palestinian families and children being shredded like through meat grinders. And then have him received in Congress and say that line, it is literally like we are living in a twilight zone where you can just say it so it's true, but it doesn't matter if you are in the middle of a genocide. And that to me is like, it actually doesn't matter how many Palestinians he kills, because at the end of the day, he's just going to come out and say, I didn't kill anybody. And everyone's going to go, yes, amazing. And that's it. That's the standard. That is the level of the discourse. That is the standard, of scrutiny that is applied to him, which is basically he can just say one sentence and that will collectively rebut 10 months of raw footage of annihilation.
I understand what you're saying, and I don't believe that. And that's why I wasn't watching his address.
You don't believe that. And that may be true in certain circles where we're like, no, actually, the evidence shows otherwise. But the fact that he can be received in US Congress and that rebuttal can stand, and he can, and Michael, it wasn't just that he was like received, it was that he was received with glee. Like people acted like it was the Messiah. Like it was your favorite, musical artist that you are just so fanboy about, right? It was like that kind of energy. Like they could not be more excited to see anyone else. Like if it was their own mother, they'd be like, get out of the way. I'm on my way to, see Netanyahu. Like that's what it felt like.
Yeah.
If it was like Granny in a wheelchair, they would have like pushed her off a cliff to get to him. Like, do you get what I'm saying? It was not just that they welcomed him, it was the way they welcomed him. There was like this eagerness about the glee. It was hysteria. It was actually hysteria. The word is hysteria.
So Abby Martin made the point on Breakthrough News that it's like inviting Hitler to speak after we found out about the Holocaust, where there's no plausible deniability anymore because we're literally watching this on our phone screens. I, of course, referenced multiple Holocaust survivors who have said that it's exactly like what Nazi Germany has done. I posted the testimony of multiple Holocaust survivors, people who said that what the occupation is doing to Palestinians is exactly the same as what was done to Jewish people in World War II. Forget that the Nazis were supported by the West and well received by the West as well. Nazis sold out Madison Square Garden.
People do not know this.
Yeah, there's literal
Like
footage
MSG.
of Madison Square Garden lit up with Nazi insignia. And it's no different from what happened in the halls of Congress. Literally, we invited the head Nazi to come speak, and he was well received within our halls of Congress.
And by the way, other people are making this comparison as well. Like Craig Mukhaiber is making this comparison. The UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, commented on a post that he had made saying she was thinking the same thing. And just the mere fact that that was posted, now there's this hysteria on the Zionist side saying, oh, she must be unseated. This is evidence of anti-Semitism. And it's like, at what point do you say, for people who have survived the Holocaust, who are actual victims of Nazism, for themselves to be anti-Semites? And if they're saying something because they've lived something, and they're probably the best people to turn to in terms of identifying these patterns again and again, at what point do you just let them make that analysis and you don't try to go after every single person who agrees with them as somehow only being driven by bigotry and hate? Perhaps they are driven by the 10 months of uninterrupted bodies that they have seen be burned and shredded and sniped. When you have that Dr. Mark Perlmutter, who visited Gaza multiple times during this genocide and sits down and does an interview and says, I have seen multiple children. I was treating children on a daily basis that would arrive with multiple sniper shots to the head and chest. And he goes, that's not an accident to hit child in the head with a sniper multiple times. Those things are not accidents. This is not unintentional. This is by design. When he tells you that's his testimony, and he says, well, Gaza was the first time I've held a 6-year-old's brain in my hand. Hadn't done that before Gaza. When he says that what he saw in Gaza collectively is superseded by over 30 years of visiting war zones combined, and he was at ground zero in September 11th, and he's traveled all over the world to conflict zones, and he says Gaza was worse than all of that combined. At what point do you start listening to these people of conscience, including Jewish people, who are whistleblowing the whole thing and saying, wait a minute, no, listen to our testimony. We count for something to counter this Zionist narrative.
Do you remember there was an article that was published? It was an op-ed that was like, is God anti-Semitic?
Yeah.
Now Zionists are like, aren't Holocaust survivors anti-Semitic? Aren't the people who literally survived the Holocaust Jew haters? And it's like, huh, okay. So there's no boundary. Like
There's no boundary, dude. There's no
there's no
boundary.
place that you won't go as far as like
No,
mental
no,
anguish or like
no,
mental gymnastics.
no.
Yeah.
There's no
And
place,
then
there's no identity, there's no person, there's no experience that renders you safe from that. We are driven by the fact that we are being murdered every day. And we would
yeah,
like the murder
so
to stop, please.
there's a famous photo of a guy named August Landmesser, and it's Nazi Germany. All of the people are doing the Hail Hitler around him, but he's got his arms folded. And I mashed up that picture with the picture of Rashida Tlaib in Congress while she's holding up her sign, and literally everybody else is applauding
Yeah.
this Hitler like figure. And it's, you know, I wasn't the only person who made that connection. I saw online a few other people had a similar idea. And it's because anybody who knows the history of both of these things understands that those were similar moments in history. If we
Oh, yes.
assign value to anything that he says by watching it, by trying to debunk it, then we actually give him more credence than he deserves,
Sure.
right?
Sure. And I agree with you.
He does not deserve to be watched. He certainly does not deserve to be applauded, and he doesn't even need to be debunked because
Right.
people have cell phones. People have
Right. Right.
literally been watching the bodies pile up in
Right.
Palestine at the hands of the Zionist regime. And I think people are actually collectively sick of the bullshit. Like, they're sick of being lied to by their own politicians, and they're certainly sick of being lied to by some like foreign politician, even though he grew up in Philadelphia.
Right. And the thing is like you're absolutely right. Like the fact that we would have to sit here and debunk it is in and of itself absurd when the totality of the evidence has been invading your life, your eyes, your brain for every day for 10 months now. And I sat here and I was like, well, how would one even debunk it? And I was like, well, the day after he spoke, I saw a decapitated toddler whose head
Right.
was fully detached. And it wasn't you could the head was you could still see all the features. It was literally just a head and it was a body separated from a head after an Israeli airstrike in Gaza. And so I was like, so is that I mean, is that how I rebut it with just, the very next day, that's what happened. And then the day after that, they bombed a girls' school where thousands of Palestinians were, displaced, were sheltering, and they've killed tens of Palestinians, injured hundreds more in that one particular airstrike. And that was just the weekend after he spoke. Like that wasn't even, you know what I mean? Like that wasn't even all the last 10 months. That was just the weekend after he spoke. And that wasn't even all that happened that weekend. That was just like two things that happened that weekend. It's an
It is an
absurdity.
absurdity to try and dissect the things that he says. Like, you wouldn't see a schizophrenic person like yelling out nonsense and be like, I need to debunk that.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. I need to
Because
debunk.
most people would be like, oh, like that person is clearly living out demons.
Right.
And what they're saying has actually no relevancy to real life, right?
Sure.
I think most people are familiar with that now. I think that
Yeah.
for the longest time, they could say something and get away with it. Although, an instance of that right now is the airstrike that happened in occupied Syria, and you have the entire media apparatus running with a Hezbollah strike, but that's actually not a fact. Hezbollah has disavowed it, and we know that it's not a Hezbollah strike because if it was, it would have been a military installation instead of a playground, right? They don't bomb children like that. And also, Hezbollah would have published video of any operation that came out, whereas we have eyewitnesses from the ground of the Syrian strike, and they're like, it was an Iron Dome strike.
It's just this constant like stream of uninterrupted lies. And then as a Palestinian, you have to sit here and decide, like, what is it important for you to spend time rebutting and correcting the narrative. And so much of the Palestine pod is just correcting the narrative. And so much of the advocacy that exists is just correcting the narrative and saying, no, that's literal propaganda. These are lies. This is what the evidence actually shows. And in a sense that I think, we've been talking a lot about the utility of international law, the limits of international law, what can it do? One of the things that I think it is actually, we don't talk about it enough in terms of what international law can do, is the benefit of having the written arguments on the historical record, because they are a form of rebutting the propaganda. South Africa's pleadings, where they lay out in excruciating detail 4 months of Israeli airstrikes and policy towards Gaza during the genocide, is a form of rebutting the narrative. And that is what will be preserved, historically speaking. And that's important. That's important. That somebody sits down and writes out the actual truth of what happened is important.
The Zionist record is like, we've killed no civilians. Also, we'll slaughter all of these human animals.
Yeah. And then day two, like Yoav Gallant on October 9th, you will get no food, water, fuel, or aid. Nothing is going in. Total siege. Also, Benjamin Netanyahu last week, we let so much aid into Gaza. We let, tens of thousands of trucks, 40,000 tons. We let in more aid after than we did before. Gaza is just, we did everything right. Hamas is stealing all the aid. And it's like, but the UN data shows that you didn't let in anything for weeks. And it's like, it's what are you basing this? And also, you said you weren't going to let anything in. So what are you talking about? They're just, when they see us on the beach and they're like, oh, look at them. They're on the beach. They're having a great time. Nothing is wrong. They're not being murdered.
Nobody's ever starved at the beach.
Right?
Like,
You're like, what are you talking about?
They say it's like they're playing Mad Libs, right? Where they just like fill in words that don't make sense.
Right. My grandma told me, she's like, did you know that Netanyahu brings his laundry for the Americans to wash? And I was like, yeah, Grandma, Tata, that was an article in the Washington Post from a few years ago. And she's like, the Americans, you just found out about this now, but we've known about this for decades. This is what the Zionists do. They bring all their dirty laundry, literally suitcases and suitcases filled with dirty laundry, for the White House to clean. And for those of you who don't know what I'm referring to, there's a Washington Post article from several years ago that speaks about how it is sort of just like a White House practice to offer to foreign heads of state the possibility that they have their suits dry cleaned, so that when they are on official business, they don't, they're not wearing a wrinkled shirt or whatever. And
it's usually like one or two items. Like it's not usually a full load of laundry.
Not like what you wore to the gym 3 weeks ago, Apparently Netanyahu takes this policy very seriously, and he brings to Washington suitcases filled with dirty laundry. Who even knows? It might not even be his own. It might even be like other people's dirty laundry. And he makes the Americans clean his dirty laundry. And they do. And in the article, the best part about it is that at some point, an anonymous White House individual who refused to give their name out of fear of, retaliation, obviously.
Why do you think they'd be afraid? What do you think what could they possibly be scared of?
Right. They said that the first time it happened, when Netanyahu brought like 85 suitcases or whatever, I don't know, I'm exaggerating, of dirty laundry to clean, they said, we were like, well, maybe he did just come from like another country and then he didn't have a chance to do his laundry, and maybe it was, they thought it was circumstantial. And they go, but after years of doing the exact same thing every time he comes to the US, we realized that this was intentional.
Do you think that, like, Mrs. Netanyahu is like, oh, do you want to do a load of laundry or whatever? And then he's just like, nah, we're headed to the US. We'll let them take care of it.
100%. That's exactly what I think is happening.
That's wild.
It's wild. It's wild. The best is I'm in like a group chat and somebody like referenced this story, and some of the other people in the group chat were like, source, we can't just be saying false things around here, because they were like, trying to be like, hey, like, this sounds like an Arab conspiracy theory, against Zionists. And
Okay.
it's
the group chat that you're in sounds like a buzzkill. Okay. The group chats that I'm in, like, we say something and we source it. We don't need to
no, but the
be on
best was
top of one another like that.
the best was like, I wrote back and I was like, the source is the Washington Post, and I added the article, and they were like, what? Because people couldn't believe it. It doesn't sound real.
The U.S. is laundering more than money, folks.
There's a lot to talk about since we've actually done an episode alone. It's been like a couple of weeks, I guess. There's been a lot of developments on the political front, on the international law front, on the advocacy front, developments on
really
the ground.
Kind of a slow news week, I thought.
I don't want to spend too much time, if any, actually talking about the ICJ ruling on the legality of the occupation, only because I'm going to refer you guys to the Mondoweiss episode that was recorded with Craig Mochaiber, who I think handles it perfectly. And I don't want to repeat something that's already been done well. So if that is interesting to you guys and you want to hear an analysis of that, I'll send you over to the episode of the Mondoweiss podcast, which was published on July 25th. Craig Mochaiber dissects the ICJ's bombshell ruling on the Israeli occupation, and that will give you a sense of the implications, consequences, and also what is the content of the ruling itself, and then how we can leverage it for the purposes of the broader liberation struggle. It's like 53 minutes of content only focused on that. So
if you are currently listening to the Palestine pod, stop, okay? And listen to another podcast. That's what we always say.
Okay, that's not what I meant by this. I just don't want to repeat all that work which has already been done. I want to talk about some of the other developments. Remember in 2021 when there were supposed to be Palestinian elections and then Mahmoud Abbas canceled them?
Yes. Do you remember when we recorded an episode 2 years ago with Diana Butu that was like overthrow Abbas?
Yeah. Yeah, go check that episode out, guys. That's me referring you
to older episodes of the Palestine pod, not this one. We're basically just going to spend this whole podcast referring you to other podcasts, even if they are our own from a while ago.
Hey, that stuff is relevant. Actually, someone drew my attention to the fact that in early 2023, I was on one of the episodes of the Palestine pod commenting on how so far in 2023, Israel had killed more Palestinians and was on track to killing more Palestinians than it had in the previous year. And the previous year's rate of Israel killing Palestinians had exceeded that which it had done in the last several years. And I had made a prediction that in 2023, Israel was going to kill more Palestinians than it ever had in a very, very, very long time. And one of our listeners was saying how eerie it was to listen to that because it was a few months before October 7th. And, I'm not psychic. It was just the obvious consequence of 76 years of impunity. If you get away with a crime and you get away with it over and over and over and over, what ends up happening inevitably is that you will commit more crimes. Your crimes will become more vicious, more frequent, and they will become more destructive. And that is what anybody who has two brain cells looking at the situation could conclude.
Yes, that's why Netanyahu keeps coming with more and more laundry.
And more lies.
Yeah.
And more lies and more denial of the crimes that he's committing, because there is absolutely nobody in the US seriously trying to hold him to account. And if they're willing to clap for him when he says we've killed no civilians, even though you all have seen him kill thousands and thousands of Palestinian families since October 7th, and he gets received with, this ecstatic glee, then all that really means is that's just a green light to kill more Palestinians, because it means that you can kill 100,000, 200,000, whatever the number actually is, and nothing happens. So why not kill more?
I don't know if you know this, but the way to enforce international law is to give a standing ovation.
That is exactly what he needs to know, that none of that matters to him. In his own words, right? We want to finish the job. The job is extermination, and we still haven't finished. So let us finish the job. And then he was received with claps, and that was the green light. Go ahead, finish the job, complete the annihilation. I'm watching videos of Gaza right now, and I'm seeing the rapid spread of skin diseases amongst Palestinian children, toddlers, like 2-3 years old, with horrible skin diseases. Their skin is literally peeling off, and there's no medication. These are all very treatable skin diseases, which could be treated if there was medication, but there is no medication because Israel doesn't allow it into Gaza. And I'm watching this, and I'm like, remember back in November when one of their former retired army generals said, no, let disease spread because it will help us achieve our aims faster? That was November. And now we're in July and disease has spread. So this is all part of the plan. This is the plan is working perfectly in accordance with what was set out in the very beginning. The people dying of starvation, it's not an accident. It's because they wanted to starve us to death, because they were having discussions about, oh, well, actually, we can kill more people through starvation than we actually can through bombs. So starvation, we should use that as a weapon, right? These are all things that were discussed and planned, and the policy was intentional. This isn't like an accidental byproduct of. This is the point.
Yes, that actually transitions into the reintroduction of polio in Gaza, which was almost eradicated and now is spreading again. And the only folks who have access to the vaccinations are, of course, the genociders, the occupation army. Polio, which is a super 1940s disease. So they really are going back to the Nazi era. That's not the only thing that connects them.
At least, yeah, but that's one thing.
Hey, who else was caged and starved? Who else in Jewish history? Hey, who else was subject to disease and then operated on by doctors and scientists? Who? Me, the history owl.
Right. No, we started this talking about Mahmoud Abbas canceling the elections, and then we like super transitioned into something else.
Let's go back into Abbas.
I mentioned this because of the recent announcement that Hamas and Fatah and other Palestinian factions have signed an agreement in Beijing announcing their unity, overcoming 17 years now of internal division between the two main Palestinian political factions. And the deal, basically, the point of it is to say, okay, we're agreeing to form a, quote, interim national reconciliation government. And the point of this is that this government is intended to take charge of West Bank and Gaza in an era after the genocide, whenever the genocide ends, and to prepare for elections and to leverage the ICJ ruling on the illegality of Israel's occupation and the fact that the occupation needs to end in order to push forward an independent state and to exclude, importantly, any foreign role over any part of occupied territory after the ceasefire. This is interesting because it's not the first time that Hamas and Fatah have attempted to reconcile, and it remains to be seen whether this is actually going to have an impact in terms of governance and whether it's going to be a way to resist occupation in that sense.
Yeah, for background, we should let people know that the Palestinian Authority are collaborators with the occupation. We covered years ago when they killed Nizar Banat, who was a critic of the PA. And just recently, the Palestinian Authority continues along the same lines. They have kidnapped activists Ghassan al-Sadi and Fakhri Jaradat, currently political prisoners. Both activists were abducted by the PA forces in the last few weeks. Notably, they both were involved in Enough is Enough movement, which opposes the Palestinian Authority's actions. And Fakhri is on hunger strike in the PA prisons. Similarly, Hassan has been kidnapped and jailed by the PA several times in recent years and has previously announced hunger strikes. So just a little background on the fact that the PA are collaborators and very likely to try and throw Hamas under the bus and blame them for not capitulating to the occupation. So I'm skeptical of this news of a joint government.
Well, I think you are not the only one to be skeptical, right? Because all previous efforts to reconcile have, in the last several years have not been successful, right? So you're not the only person, I think, who is skeptical in this sense. But the facts are different now, and it remains to be seen whether that reality is going to have an impact on whether these two factions, but also other Palestinian political factions, are going to be able to say, no, we need to get together, adopt a unified plan for resisting foreign intervention. First and foremost, Israeli occupation, but also that of the US. Because at the same time that this is happening, you have the US saying, oh, there will be no role for Hamas in a they call it a post-war, we'll call it post-genocide Gaza. And the only thing I want to say about that is that part of the problem in the way that Palestinians have been dealt with by the Western world is that the Western world thinks that it's for them to decide our future. It's not. It's not for you to decide. It's not for Matthew Miller, some guy from, I don't know where the fuck he's from.
Wherever Count Dracula resides.
Wherever Count Dracula Chocula. Did you say Chocula?
Chocula, the cereal man. Yeah.
Okay, I call him Dracula if you guys know on Instagram, but it's not for Dracula or anyone who may be associated with Dracula to tell Palestinians how they should live, determine their fate, determine their future, tell them what type of governance to have. It's actually for Palestinians to decide. That's our right. That's the right of self-determination under international law. So the US has no say in this. The US has no right to even have a say in this. So the fact that they go out there and they say day in and day out, oh, well, we've been very clear, they cannot have it's not up to you to decide. Just like it wasn't up to you to decide when Palestinians initially voted for Hamas in democratic elections that former President Jimmy Carter witnessed and said they were the most fair and free elections he's ever seen. And in the aftermath of those elections, Palestinians were punished for their choice. And that's when the US and Israel imposed massive sanctions on Palestinians in the aftermath of democratic elections. All I'm trying to say here is that at the end of the day, only Palestinians can decide what their future is going to be and who's going to represent them. And whoever that is, whatever party they decide to represent them, that choice must be respected. Because if you claim to care about the principles of democracy, then you have to care about the principle itself, and not only if the outcome suits you or if the outcome is one that you agree with. And Palestinians, who knows what they will decide? Let's put it this way. At this point, Mahmoud Abbas knows that if there were an election, he would not survive it. He's 88, so he may not survive it for that reason, but he may also not survive it because he doesn't have popularity among Palestinians, precisely in part for the reasons that you've just stated, Michael, because of this just cynicism about what collaborating with the occupation has got us. It's got us nothing. It's got us more entrenched occupation. And there are more Palestinian political parties than even just Hamas and Fatah. So the fact is, if we want to actually see this through, there needs to be elections. There needs to be a democratic process where Palestinians have their voices heard, and that is implemented without any interference from any outside body.
Jimmy Carter was like, I saw their elections, even fairer than mine.
I'm telling you, that was a near perfect quote, though. He literally said they're the freest and fairest elections I've ever observed. He wrote about it. For those of you that are interested, former President Jimmy Carter wrote about the 2006 elections in his book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. And if you haven't read it, I do think you should read it because it was one of the first instances of the word apartheid reaching the US mainstream audience. And at the time, he was completely ignored. He went on a book tour all around the US. He went, university after university. He did, media spot after media spot. And the guy was just ignored. He was ignored. He was, just swept under the rug. They were like, what's this old crazy guy talking about? When in reality, he was very sane and lucid to write what he wrote, and everything he wrote still stands true today. And if we are where we are today, it's in part because of the fact that the warnings that he echoed in that book were completely ignored. And I would just like to see Joe Biden try to write, a sentence, much less a book.
I'd like to see Joe Biden color within the lines. What are you talking about?
You're like a sentence.
Joe Biden gets a coloring book. He's like, dinner served. You know what I mean? Like, also, I think really quickly, we need to talk about Joe Biden, and then we'll stop talking about him forever.
Oh, sure.
Because, we told everybody that Joe Biden was not competent. We were like, hey, we can see with our eyes and our ears that this man is clearly not fit for political office.
For months now.
And they gaslit, right? Everybody gaslit us. Everybody was like, how dare you? He's the only option. You got to beat Trump. Blah, 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 blah. All of the same things that they're saying right now. And we were like, hey, no, just so you know, he's not. We can tell he is clearly out of it. And then they acknowledged that. They were like, okay, yeah, you're right. He's out. But now you got to get behind Kamala. And there's not a moment where anybody is like, hey, sorry that we tried to force feed you a dead guy. Hey, sorry that we literally gaslit the entire country into thinking that Weekend at Bernie's was a documentary. Hey, sorry, right? There's none of that. There's just this immediate shift into, well, now you have to support this top cop who literally argued in court for slave labor in prisons, imprisoned people on procedural issues, and is somebody who has tried to fight against the depopulation of prisons for nonviolent offenders. You have to support this person. Otherwise, you are trying to get Trump in office. And it's just like, could we have a moment where we are acknowledged for the fact that we recognized that this was not the best possible option.
No,
and to this
that's
day
the
is
thing.
still not.
No, and you're absolutely right. Like, please acknowledge the people who, for months now, for maybe even years now, have been saying that this man is senile, this man has dementia, and we were told that we were being disrespectful, that we were the ones who were outrageous, and I mean, even like spokesperson who was like, did he have a bad day? He had a bad day. He was sick that day. He had the sniffles, and you're like,
was he a bad boy? He was a bad boy. Will we put his face in the newspaper? We will, and he won't pee on the floor again. Okay. And it's like, what are you talking about? Okay.
But you're absolutely right. I don't look, I've seen a lot of Palestinian content creators in the last couple of days and weeks since Kamala, came out and this whole announcement was made, which surprised no one, saying, people are now gaslighting us and saying, no, that we have to support Kamala. And I'm like, to be honest, I'm not really seeing that. And maybe the algorithm's not showing me those people who are like, wait, no, it's going to get way better because of Kamala. Maybe I'm sure that stuff probably exists, but I'm not seeing it.
You don't have any libs in your feed? Because that's wild. I've seen a lot of people switch up. I've seen people who were previously outspoken for Palestine be like actively happy to support this top cop.
That's wild. So I haven't seen that, but I'm saying it probably certainly exists. I'm just not getting it. The algorithm is showing me weird things these days.
It's like shit libs are everywhere. And they were among us, and I had no idea.
Here's the thing. Here's what I want to say about that. She's a Zionist.
She bragged about, as a child, she fundraised for the JNF. And we've covered on the Palestine Pod about how the JNF does greenwashing, where they have planted over with non-native trees to erase the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, to erase Palestinian villages that they are planted on top of.
Most of the Palestinian villages that were destroyed in 1948 as a part of the Nakba of 1948 were covered up by JNF planted trees. And what they do is they say, hey, we have this amazing mission, plant a tree in Israel. And it's like, what is that tree being planted on top of? Is it being planted on top of the ruins of my grandparents' village and their literal bones? They were massacred and placed in mass graves by Zionist paramilitary forces. And actually, speaking of the JNF, very, very interesting recent news to report from this last week. JNF actually had their charitable status revoked in Canada this last week. The Canadian Revenue Agency notified the JNF Canada that it was revoking the organization's charitable status because the government body found its original 1967 main charitable object unacceptable. This is something that we should be seeing happen everywhere the JNF is operating, because this organization is used to facilitate, cover up, aid, and abet in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the depopulation of Palestine and the displacement forcibly of Palestinians from their lands and villages and cities and homes. And Dr. Salman Abu Sitta, who is the author of the Atlas of Palestine, I visited when I was in Kuwait a few months ago, has told me that one of the reasons why he wrote this book, which details all of the villages and cities and towns that were in Palestine in 1948 and prior, how many people lived in those areas, how many homes there were, which family names were in which cities, and so on and so forth. He says, I'm doing this precisely to provide evidence for anyone who wants to take the JNF to court in order to revoke their charitable status, in order to litigate the question of the forced displacement of Palestinians from their homes and to litigate the Nakba. I am doing this to provide evidence for that record. And this is an incredible victory in that sense. I don't know if it's over yet or if they're going to try to appeal this decision, but it's something that we should certainly support. They have Palestinian blood on their hands, and they're an integral part of trying to change the facts on the ground, to erase the history and presence of Palestinians. So in the same way that today we're watching Zionist occupation forces in Gaza literally change the terrain, they're uprooting Palestinians, they're destroying entire neighborhoods, but also one thing that they're doing is they're destroying the roads so that there's no more roads, it's just mud. And the reason they're doing that is to make it look like there was nothing there to begin with. Right? Because if you have a bunch of roads and you have a bunch of houses, it's clear that you have a civilization and you have a society. But if all that you see is mud for miles and miles and miles, well, in 10 or 20 years, you can make the argument, well, there was nobody here to begin with. It was always just barren, right? And then we have to go, no. There were 2.3 million people there until October 2023, and then you displaced all of them from their homes, and then you uprooted everyone, and you destroyed everything, and you turned all of the pavement into mud. And it's that constant cycle of us re-correcting the narrative that we're forced into in these types of conversations. But I do think it's important to highlight that the JNF is not this the way that Kamala Harris painted them out to be, as, oh, I remember fondly, taking around the JNF buckets and fundraising to plant forests and plant trees in Israel. That's not what this is. So that's just an important sidebar. But Kamala Harris is not going to save you. She's not going to stop the genocide.
The genocide won't be stopped with Rashida Tlaib's sign.
Or Kamala Harris's, it's true that the photos are sad, what's coming out of Gaza, or whatever her quote was. She said one thing where it was like, oh, look, she has empathy. And it's like, no, that's not the standard. The standard is freedom. It's not that, oh, you saw one photo that made you a little sad, but then you signed, the documents transferring thousands of more, bombs to Israel. That's not the standard. We shouldn't be excited about nothing. We shouldn't,
Yeah. The genocide will now be overseen by Mamala.
Right.
She's this figure that people assign value to because of her identity, right? Because she's a woman, because she is Black, because she is Indian. But more importantly than that, she is a Zionist. She is a capitalist. She is an imperialist. And her interests in the freedom, in the liberation of those intersectional groups that she is a part of, it's for show. It's obviously theatrics. They're trying to force feed us another Obama, but they don't remember that Obama went on to kill people in Yemen like the second or third day. He bombed a wedding party, and then he received the Nobel Peace Prize. He dropped so many bombs that the United States ran out of bombs for a bit. But he was Black.
Yeah.
He gave really good speeches.
That meme that's like,
yes,
Republicans, and then it's just like bombs, and then it's like Democrats, and it's like gay bombs.
Yes, it's the meme that I posted when Claudia Sheinbaum was elected the president of Mexico, because that's what the elites do. They recognize that people can be fooled by identity politics. They can't just cram down a dead guy who supported segregation anymore. They are we tried that, okay? We tried to run a dead man who supported segregation and the crime bill and Joe Biden.
Oh, okay. He's the dead guy. Okay. I wasn't sure.
Hey, let me know when you catch up to the episode of the Palestine pod that we're on. And then they were like, okay, we can't do that anymore. So now we have to give them something that they can be excited about. And what people are excited about is identity politics. Folks, that's been another episode of the Palestine Pod. Thank you all so much for listening. Check out our full episodes and sources at www.palestinepod.com. Follow us on Instagram at @thepalestinepod. Send us an email at palestinepod@gmail.com. And support us on Patreon, www.patreon.com/PalestinePod. That's been another episode of the pod. Thank you all so much for listening. Have as good a day as you can.
We can start telling people to join the Patreon. The show wouldn't be possible without a Patreon. You got to get on our Patreon. Support us on Patreon. You can, because I've been watching all these other podcasts and they just keep plugging Patreon all the time.
Yeah, I'm going to clip what you just did right now.
Okay.